we might leave the rest of chapter 9 for next time, just because we're running short on time, and I very, very much want to cover this question of the historicity of the flood. So in other words, is this a real historical event of the entire world being flooded? Interested in your thoughts.
On one hand, I go yes, because this is our Bible, this is our book, this is, like, as Christians, this is our history. On the other hand, I'm like, well, I know that the Bible is written in different styles, so this could be some sort of poetic way of writing, though there's a part of me that doesn't think so, because it's so very specific in what it's saying here.
Down to dates, yeah.
Yeah, down to the dates, measurements of the boat and everything. Then my brain also goes, well, the Earth did have an ice age, and that ice age ended, so maybe there's some linkage there when everything melted, just like in the Ice Age movie. It's like, oh, is there something there? But yeah, for me, I don't know much about, like, if it sits in history or whether. I've seen a couple of YouTube videos. Haven't actually really watched them, but I've seen a couple of YouTube videos that have tried to prove it. Your thoughts, Morgan, on that?
I don't know. I think big natural disaster, yeah, but it just seems very unrealistic.
Yeah.
Fair.
I just don't see bad animals and savage animals getting on with these humans for that long on a boat, and it just doesn't seem very realistic to me.
I mean, we always have to remember that we are reading stories about God here, and so we can sometimes just totally dismiss all claims of realism in the sense of God can do anything he wants. And if this is what he wanted to happen as an event in human history, every objection we have could be pretty simply solved. I'm similar to you, Josh, in the sense of I've never put a lot of thought into this story until this past week.
Yeah.
I was like, I can't come on the podcast as the expert and not have well thought out things. But until then, I had never put any time into thinking what was going on here in an early chapter of Genesis, in a story that is so far removed from Jesus, the foundation of my faith, that I just hadn't spent time on it. But let me tell you where I'm currently at. And then I've got 8 points to walk us through to maybe lead you to the same conclusion. So here's my view. It's also the same view as John Walton in his book, The Lost World of the Flood. Go have a read of it. If you don't want to read it, then I know John Dixon in his podcast, Undeceptions, had John Walton on as a guest not that long ago. Also worth listening to. Here's the view. The biblical flood story uses hyperbole to picture a local flood as a worldwide flood to communicate an important theological message. So that's, I think, where I'm sitting right now in terms of my view of the flood. Let me walk through my 8 points of leading us maybe to the same conclusion. Point number 1, Genesis makes claims about real events in a real past. We talked in our first episode about genre, and I made the claim that from Genesis 2 onwards, it's very much just a historical recount, and the genre doesn't change between this story of Noah and the story of Abraham too much. Like, it seems to be just giving us history. So point 1 is Genesis is making claims about history. My second point is that in these chapters, Genesis does depict the flood as a global event. So I don't think the Christian explanation of it just being a local flood is quite enough, because it literally says that the water covered the tallest mountain. There is no local flood in history that got that tall. It also doesn't fit thematically. Like, the theme of this section is God was so angry with the sin of humanity, he wanted to wipe them out. There's no point in human history where all of humans lived in one small area that a local flood would have done the job. If it was a local flood, why did the birds need to be on the ark? Because I'm sure they lived further afield than wherever this local flood was happening. I just think when you read this story, we do get the image of a global flood, and there's no way around it. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, geology does not support a worldwide flood, and flood stories from around the world do not prove a worldwide flood. Now, floods are so common in the world that there's a reason why almost every ancient culture has a flood narrative, because they're just so common. But there is no scientific evidence that is convincing enough to show that there was a worldwide flood. Here's a quote by Stephen O. Moshier. The worldwide scientific community overwhelmingly rejects the geological interpretation of the flood geologists. So those are the people making those YouTube videos that you've seen, Josh, is here's the evidence for the flood.
Yes.
Facebook yesterday literally suggested a group to me that was the flood was a real event. And I was like, why am I getting this suggested?
That's funny. It knows.
Yeah. There is no convincing scientific case that there was a worldwide flood. In fact, we often see the opposite.
So we've got so sort of just to, on one hand, the text is explicitly saying this is a worldwide event,
Yes.
but from a geological, historical, just how the planet works point of view, it's just impossible for that to
Yes.
happen.
Yes. That's where we're currently sitting after my third point. Here's my fourth point. The Bible often uses hyperbole to describe historical events. Let's stay in the book of Genesis for a second. Genesis 49, verse 57. All the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. Now, that same phrase, all the earth, is used here in the Genesis account of all the earth was covered with water. But do we believe that in the time of Joseph, so about 2000 BC, that Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals in 2000 BC travelled to Egypt to collect grain to take back to the Americas or take back to Australia because the whole world was in famine? I would suspect that not even people who fight fiercely for the historicity of a global flood would agree on that point. Joshua 1 to 12 pictures the total and utter annihilation of the Canaanites in the Promised Land. However, the second half of that book pictures Israelite living with Canaanites. And so again, we see hyperbole.
Yeah.
Even Jesus uses hyperbole when he says the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, because that's not strictly the truth.
No.
The orchard seed is smaller. And so I think it's fair to say, as a literary technique, the biblical authors will often use hyperbole. Now, that leads me to my fifth point. Genesis presents a hyperbolic account of the flood. Now, some people may claim that this is lying, but if my wife tries to pick up a bag and says, wow, that weighs a ton, I know she's using hyperbole. It's not a lie in any sense of the word, because she's making a point by what she's saying. Her point is that this is insanely heavy. Why have you packed the bag this way, Lachlan? In the same way that ancient people potentially recognized that this was a hyperbolic account. And because they recognize the exaggeration going on, it doesn't make it a lie or doesn't make it false. And so that is what I want to say about point 5. Josh, Morgan, comments as I slowly work through these 8 points.
I think it's like previous things we've talked about with these points you give us. Like, I don't want to overthink it because now I'm just really overthinking it all.
Yeah, fair.
That's true. And you also want to get like that full picture for like sort of making any
a final
judgment.
comment.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, let me go through the rest of the points and then we'll get your thoughts. Point number 6. The flood story has a real local flood behind it. If this is a hyperbolic account, there's still a real flood somewhere. One option given is something Josh mentioned before, which is 10,000 BC, which is the end of the last ice age. That's totally an option. I don't think that lines up with my view of Adam being a Middle Eastern farmer, but that's an option. We have other ancient accounts of a flood, which happened in about 3000 BC. So the Sumerian king list mentions a big flood taking place in about 3000 BC, but we don't have any evidence of a flood big enough in that time period that would probably be the basis of this type of story. I think the most compelling case for what local flood might have been the case is presented by William Ryan and Walter Pittman, who are both scientists, and they've suggested in 5600 BC. So you know where the Black Sea currently is? Picture the world map in your mind. The Black Sea just above Turkey. That used to be a freshwater lake. That used to be a smallish freshwater lake. In about 5600 BC, floodwaters smashed through basically where Istanbul is today, smashed through there and turned what that saltwater lake was into the Black Sea we know today. Now, that event was devastating. Like, any humans that lived near the shore of this previously existing freshwater lake would have been flooded out. The levels in that area would have risen hugely, and that whole area is no longer good, fertile land with a fresh water source nearby. It's now salt water. And so there was this huge geological event in 5600 BC, and it's just close enough to the Middle East to sort of explain what could be the basis for the Noah's story. Especially since when you think about where Noah's Ark landed, in the Ararat Mountains. It's in that area. And so I think that is potentially a really, really good option.
And if you lived there and that's all you knew, your entire world would be crumbling down.
If not thousands of deaths. Like, many, many people would have died when that flood happened. And the only way to survive was to go to higher land, but your old place of living was no longer habitable. Pretty huge event. Here's my point 7. This local flood is intentionally described as a global flood for rhetorical purposes and theological reasons. I'm going to jump straight to point 8 from there, which is, here's those theological reasons. The theological reasons are every story up until this point in Genesis has been showing that humans are sinners, that God judges sinners, but God remains gracious towards his sinful creatures. Like there's this pattern of sin and judgment, but also grace happening. We also see in this story divine presence, the establishment of order, how order is undermined. We see that the flood narrative points at God's power and freedom over creation, his deadly anger over sin, and also his gracious redemption in light of judgment. The only other point I'll say about theological purposes is just from the Middle East, we have several other flood stories. And by looking at the differences between those flood stories and the one we have in the Bible, we can also see some of the different theological points that are probably trying to be explained by recording their own version of a flood story. And this is, in all of the other flood stories, there are many gods involved. We have the one Yahweh involved. In the other flood stories, the gods come across as flawed in both their motivations and their actions, whereas Yahweh is perfect. The reason for the flood in these other flood stories is because of the noise of mankind. Like they're just annoying the gods. But in this version, it's because they are evil. After the flood, in all of the flood stories, the hero always offers a sacrifice. In the pagan flood stories of that same time, the gods are starving because they feed off human sacrifices. And it sort of shows their stupidity in wiping humans out. So they kind of swarm the sacrifice. Whereas Noah's sacrifice is the beginning of this brand new covenant. It's the first moment of this covenant between God and man. Those are my 8 points, which hopefully lead up to the main point, which is that I think the biblical flood story uses hyperbole to picture a local flood as a worldwide flood to communicate important theological messages. Whew. Okay, to the table. I've said a lot of words.
There's a lot to think about there.
I think after hearing all of that, like I said before, I'm like overthinking it. But now looking back on it, it's hard to imagine a global flood. Like I didn't really think about the whole world flooding. Like I think I just thought of it as like just a lake going up. But trying to think about the whole world flooding at one time confuses me after hearing all that. So I'm not really sure where I sit with it, but I don't know. I have no idea.
Fair.
I'm just confused now.
Josh, your
All
thoughts?
right.
I know I went through a lot there and very fast.
Yeah, it's similar to Morgan, like sort of saying you sort of like don't know what to sort of think, and it's sort of you try not to overthink it. Because on one hand you're like, yeah, like how does a global flood make sense? But my initial thoughts was I don't like it. I don't like it. I would prefer to sit in the place of like it was a global flood, and that might just be my like I don't know dramatic sort of like storytelling creative brain of like wanting it to be this big thing, which I think is fine in my head to be, but also to on the flip side to also think about the history of it and how it sits in our own history and our understanding of how the world works. So on one hand, I'm like, I think it's twofold. On one hand, I'm like, oh, I completely get the story, but on the other hand, it's like I do understand how it works in our world, and it could just be hyperbole and sort of emphasizing a point. And as we've said before, I think the main takeaway is the God resetting. It's the message that's coming out of it, not to get so hung up on was there a global flood, was there, wasn't there, like, and really sort of like getting into the nitty gritty of that, of more just sitting in the place of God's resetting the world, but more importantly, God's giving this new covenant to his people. And that's the real takeaway point, if that makes sense. If you were sort of, still struggling on and that overthinking of like, okay, well, does this change everything about the story? Like, where do we sit? Do we, like, how much do I now believe of this story? It's like, well, if anything, just take away God's covenant, God's promise, God's agreement with us. Because that's, I think, the main point.
Yeah. It's an exceptionally important part of the story. My only encouragement to you is grab a copy of John Walton's book.
Yeah.
Read it yourself rather than my insanely fast summary that I just went through just then, because I found it quite a convincing read.
Yeah. No, that'd be quite interesting to delve into, and it's something I've never, and I'm sure everyone else has never sort of, and Morgan just said, like, I think we just don't question it. Not that we always should question it in saying that, but growing up with it, you're like, yep, flood happened. And we move on to the next story. Like,
Mm.
this is the point of the podcast. It's quite interesting to delve into it and get that better understanding of it.
Mm.
And if it was sort of the Black Sea, sort of, this is where it happened. Yeah, I can understand that everyone living there, this would have changed their entire life. Like, this would have been world ending for them. And if this was written from those people living there, from their perspectives, yeah, your entire world is ending right there.
Yep, absolutely. This is definitely one of those things that I hold loosely. Like, I'm trying my best to figure out what God is teaching in His Word, and trying to figure out how that works with all the other sources of information that God gives us. And this is where I'm at. But yeah, definitely holding it loosely and focusing on what we learn through Noah as a character.
Yes.
Because ultimately it is the teaching of the Bible that's inspired, not the event that happened that's inspired.
It's showing Noah's character, but also God's character.
Yes.